Deep in the golden light of autumn, one man and his loyal German shepherd stood beneath the oldest maple tree in Maple Hollow. This forest had witnessed greed, fire, loss, and a quiet promise that outlived them all. A soldier once searching for peace had found a legacy hidden beneath the roots. But what secret had been sleeping under this forest for nearly a century? What power could make an entire town rise together against those who tried to take it? And why did one small bell change everything? This is the story of a man, a dog, and a forest that refused to be silenced. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below and subscribe. The autumn sun began its slow descent behind the tall trees of Maple Hollow. The forest was filled with golden light and the scent of fallen leaves. A cool breeze carried the soft sound of branches rubbing against each other. The air was still. It was the kind of silence that allowed a man to hear the weight of his own thoughts. Thomas Tom Walker drove his old pickup truck down a narrow dirt road winding through the forest. The truck shook each time the tires rolled over stones hidden beneath the leaves. Tom was 46 years old. His face carried the hard lines of a man who had seen both good and bad and never truly forgot either. His hair was dark brown with streaks of gray at the temples. A thin scar ran along the bridge of his nose. His jaw showed the roughness of several days without shaving. His shoulders were broad but slightly slumped, as if years of quiet weight had rested there. Tom had once served as a combat engineer. He had built and broken things for war. War had left marks on him. It took away a marriage and a home that once held laughter. His son now lived far away. The forest had become one of the few places where silence did not hurt. Out here, silence was honest. Next to him sat Max, a 7-year-old German shepherd. The dog had a thick black and tan coat. His chest was strong. His ears were sharp and alert. His amber eyes were the kind that missed nothing. Max had stayed with Tom through long nights when memories crept in like smoke. His right ear had a small notch from a fight years ago. His movements were steady and calm. The truck rolled over a large root, and Max lifted his head. His ears moved forward. Tom looked at him and spoke softly. "What is it, buddy?" Max's body tensed. A short bark broke the silence. Then another bark came louder. Max pushed his paws against the window. Tom braked hard. The sound of crushed leaves filled the air. "Easy, boy." Then Tom heard it too. A faint cry beneath the rustle of the forest. A human voice calling for help. It came from somewhere down the slope on the right side of the road. Old instincts woke up inside Tom like an automatic switch. He turned off the engine. He grabbed the flashlight from the dashboard. He opened the door. Max jumped down. His paws landed on damp leaves. His tail stood straight. "Stay close, Max." The dog let out a low sound and moved forward with his nose close to the ground. The forest away from the road was full of fallen logs and tangled roots. The air smelled of bark and earth. Tom followed the dog down a narrow deer path. The last light of the day filtered through red and gold leaves above him. His heartbeat rose. It was not fear. It was focus. The cry came again. It was clear now. A man's voice calling for help. Tom hurried his steps. Max stopped near a huge maple tree that had fallen. Its roots were torn from the ground. A hollow space opened beneath it. An old man was trapped inside, half covered in wet leaves, one leg twisted beneath thick roots. Tom knelt beside him. The man's face was pale but awake. It was lined with the marks of time. His beard was white, and cropped close. His silver hair was swept back. His eyes were sharp blue and steady. His flannel shirt was torn at the sleeve. His jeans were muddy. His boots were old but strong. He did not look weak. He looked like someone too stubborn to give up. "Do not move." Tom kept his voice steady. The old man gave a short laugh that turned into a cough. "Not planning to, son." Tom examined the roots, holding his leg. "Name is Tom Walker. I will get you out of here." "George Whitman." The tree won this round. Tom used a broken branch as leverage. His muscles pulled hard. George's face twisted with pain, but no sound left his lips. Tom could see in his eyes that he had known pain before. Max paced slowly in a circle. His tail was steady. He sniffed George's boot once and waited. The root finally gave way. George gasped and pulled air through his teeth. "Broken?" Tom asked. "Twisted, not broken," George said. "Old bones talk too much." Tom crouched down and helped George place an arm over his shoulder. The old man was tall and wiry. His body was thin, but strong in a way only years of physical work could build. There was calm inside him even now. The forest grew darker as they moved back up the slope. The sound of crickets began. The sky between the trees burned with the last light of the sun. Tom could feel George's weight against him. It was not only the weight of his body, it was the weight of a man who carried years of quiet memories. "How long were you stuck here?" Tom asked. "A few hours," George said. "Went out to check the fence line. The roots decided they liked me." Tom could hear the rough edge in his voice. It was the voice of a man who had spent years talking to the wind and shouting across open spaces. There was humor hidden under the rasp. They reached the truck. Tom helped George into the passenger seat. Max jumped into the back of the truck. The dog sat still, his eyes fixed on the forest line, as if the night itself might step forward. Tom placed his jacket under George's injured leg. George let out a slow breath. "Haven't been rescued like this since I was 22. Got stuck in a chicken coop back then." Tom allowed a small smile. "I will drive you home." George looked at him. "You are not from around here?" "No, just passing through." But even as he said the words, Tom felt something settle inside him. He had not meant to stay. He had come to the forest for quiet, not for people. But life often began again in small moments. George gave a low hum. The forest has a way of keeping those who listen. Tom did not answer. He started the engine. The truck moved slowly through the curves of the forest road. Max was alert but calm. George stared out of the window like someone who knew every tree by heart. After a while, the forest opened to a clearing. A small cabin stood beside a narrow creek. Moss grew thick on its roof. The porch leaned slightly at the middle. An old rocking chair swayed gently with the wind. The house looked tired, but solid. Tom helped George out of the truck. Max sniffed the porch and wagged his tail in quiet beats. "You live here alone?" Tom asked. "Yes," George said. "Lived here most of my life. My wife passed 8 years ago. My children live far away. But the trees do not talk back, and I like that just fine." His voice grew softer near the end of the sentence. Tom understood that kind of quiet. Inside, the cabin smelled of cedar, tobacco, and old coffee. Tom helped George sit in a wooden chair near the fireplace. Max lay down near the door. His ears were half lowered, but ready. George leaned back. "I owe you a drink, and a story or two." Tom gave a small smile. "Maybe later. I will wrap that leg first." He told himself this was just a stop. But something had already changed. The forest outside seemed to breathe slower. It felt less like a road passing through and more like the beginning of something else. The sun rose through the thinning canopy of Maple Hollow, its light falling in soft bands over the forest. The early autumn air was cool but gentle. A thin fog lay across the ground near the creek, curling slowly like breath against the cold stones. The wind moved through the branches, and the sound of running water carried softly through the trees. Tom Walker stepped onto the old wooden bridge that crossed the narrow stream in front of the cabin. The bridge was small, made from thick planks, darkened by years of rain and time. Each step made the wood creak in a tired but familiar rhythm. Moss climbed up the posts, and beneath the bridge, the creek whispered its steady tune. Tom paused for a moment, feeling that stillness settle into his chest. It was the kind of quiet that pressed against old scars rather than healed them. Max padded ahead of him, his paws silent on the damp boards. The dog lifted his nose into the air, tail held level, every movement steady and measured. Tom watched the way Max moved, always with purpose. 7 years of companionship had made their silence fluent. Tom often trusted Max's senses more than his own. The cabin stood just beyond the bridge. Its walls were made of thick logs, weathered and dark, their edges rounded by time. The roof was thick with green moss, and the porch sagged slightly in the middle. A row of wind chimes hung beside the door, rusted and dull, moving only when the wind pushed gently. To Tom, it did not look like a stranger's house. It looked like a place that belonged to the forest itself. Inside, George Whitman leaned against the old wooden chair by the fireplace. His injured leg was wrapped with a strip of fabric that Tom had torn from an old sheet. The man looked worn, but not weak. His face was lined with age, but there was strength in the way his hands gripped the arms of the chair. He reminded Tom of men who had spent their lives working without needing to talk about it. George had been quiet since they returned the night before. Now he stared at the fire as if listening to something only he could hear. Tom recognized that kind of silence. It was the silence of someone who carried years behind their ribs. Tom crouched by the hearth and added a few logs to the fire. The flames caught and climbed, filling the room with soft light. The scent of wood smoke wrapped around them, mixing with the faint, earthy smell of the cabin itself. Max walked slowly through the living room. His nails clicked softly against the old wooden floorboards. He sniffed the air, then moved toward the fireplace. He stopped suddenly. His ears stood forward. He lifted one paw and tapped the floor 3 times in a clean rhythm. Tom froze. That signal had a meaning. Max only did that when he found something unusual, something that did not belong. George turned his head slowly, the firelight catching the silver in his beard. What's he on to? Tom tapped the floor with his boot. The sound came back hollow. Beneath the surface, something was hidden. Tom crouched down beside Max and ran his hand over the wooden plank. The floor near the fireplace was slightly warped, not from age, but from something underneath. Tom could feel the faint vibration of empty space below. George leaned forward in his chair, his voice low and steady. That floor has been like that for a long time. This cabin has more history than most folks in town like to remember. Tom met George's eyes. There was something in the old man's expression that was both distant and alert. Like a man standing on the edge of a memory, he was not sure he wanted to revisit. Max stepped back and lay down, watching the floor with alert eyes. Tom sat on his heels and pressed his hand against the edge of the plank again. George's cabin was small, but layered with years of living. On the shelves were old coffee tins, chipped mugs, and stacks of yellowed papers. The walls were decorated with photographs of a woman with dark hair, pulled back in a soft bun, standing beside George in different seasons. In one photo, she was younger, smiling at the camera. Her face carried a kind of open warmth that made the room feel less empty. George's eyes flicked toward that picture once, just long enough for Tom to notice. Tom finally spoke. "You knew something was down there." George let out a short breath through his nose. "I built this place with my father when I was a boy. He told me not everything here was meant to be found. Some things are buried for a reason." Tom studied the floor again. Buried or not, whatever was hidden beneath this plank had been here for decades. The wood was old, but the line where the board met the next was cleaner, as if it had been lifted before. Max shifted slightly, resting his head on his paws, his gaze fixed on Tom. The dog's steady breathing filled the silence between the two men. George pushed himself up from the chair slowly. He walked with a stiff limp, but there was determination in his steps. He reached for a metal hook hanging by the wall, the kind used to lift floorboards for cleaning the cellar. His movements were deliberate and slow. Years of living alone had made his gestures quiet and precise. He held the hook out to Tom. "If you're going to open it, better you do it than me. My hands are not what they used to be." Tom took the hook, crouched down again, and slid the edge beneath the plank. It lifted with a soft groan, releasing a wave of musty air. Beneath it was a dark space, just deep enough for a small chest or box. The air smelled of damp earth and iron. George stood still above him, his jaw tightening. "I never opened it after my father died. He was a quiet man. Fought in the war before mine. Came back different. Stopped talking about the forest after that." Tom understood that kind of silence better than most. The kind that came home from war, but never really left it behind. He lowered the board gently again, without pulling the chest out. He did not need to see what was inside to know it carried weight. George returned to the chair and lowered himself slowly. Max rose and walked to Tom's side, pressing his head against Tom's leg. The dog's warmth grounded him. Tom stared at the floor where the hidden space lay waiting. Something old and quiet slept beneath it. He could feel it like a pulse in the house. He did not yet know what it was, but he knew this was not the kind of thing a man could ignore. Outside, the wind pushed softly against the windows. The chimes moved with a dull sound like distant bells. Tom sat back, the fire warming his back, and looked at George. The old man's expression was calm, but his eyes were distant, fixed on a memory Tom could not see. Inside Tom's chest, a quiet understanding settled. He was not just passing through anymore. The forest had already started its work. The late afternoon sun burned low between the trees, sending long ribbons of light across the clearing around the cabin. A thin mist drifted near the creek, clinging to the stones and reeds. The forest smelled of damp earth and dry leaves. Wind whispered through the branches, carrying a quiet weight that settled over the house like a held breath. Tom Walker knelt on the floor beside the fireplace. The wooden board he had pried loose earlier now leaned against the wall. Dust hung in the air, caught in the orange glow from the fire. Max sat at Tom's side, ears forward, eyes fixed on the dark hollow beneath the floor. His chest rose and fell in steady rhythm, but every line of his body was alert. George Whitman lowered himself slowly into the chair. His injured leg was wrapped tighter today, but his face showed no sign of complaint. He had the kind of stubborn calm that came from a lifetime of fixing what broke instead of talking about it. His hands rested on his knees. His jaw was clenched, but steady. Tom slid his hand into the hollow space and felt something cold beneath layers of dust. His fingers brushed against metal. He pulled slowly, and a small iron box came free with a soft scrape. The box was dark with rust, its edges uneven, its surface carved with faint lines that time had almost erased. A single latch held the lid closed. George let out a breath that was almost a laugh, but too heavy to finish. That box was already there when I was a boy. My father told me never to touch it, said it belonged to the forest, not to us. Tom turned the box in his hands. It was heavier than it looked. He felt the weight settle into his palms, as if the metal itself carried memory. He unlatched the lid. It opened with a soft groan, the sound of hinges not used in decades. Inside lay several folded papers, their edges yellow and fragile. A faint smell of iron and old earth rose from them. Beneath the papers was a small bronze bell, no larger than Tom's palm. Its surface was engraved with curling vines and the faint inscription, "If the forest sleeps, wake her with this." The letters were shallow but clear, untouched by rust. George stared at the bell as if seeing a ghost from another lifetime. That was my father's. He used to tell me the forest listens more than people do. Tom gently lifted the stack of papers. The ink was faded but still readable. It was a legal document dated 1935, the Maple Forest Trust. It carried several signatures written in looping old handwriting. The language was simple but firm. It declared that the land around Maple Hollow was to remain under community trust, protected from commercial use, logging, or sale. Tom read the words slowly. The forest had been given a voice a long time ago. Someone had tried to make sure it would not be silenced. He felt the lines of his face tighten as a quiet understanding formed in his chest. This was more than an old piece of land. It was a promise. George rubbed his hands together slowly. I knew there was something under there. I just never thought it would be this. My father used to disappear into town whenever men with big trucks came sniffing around. He always came back looking like someone who had won a fight no one saw. Tom set the papers carefully on the floor and studied the bell again. The metal was cool, but steady against his skin. Its weight was not just physical. It carried meaning. He had spent years building bridges and clearing fields in places that never belonged to him. But this forest felt different. It was not something to take. It was something to hold. George's voice grew softer. He fought in the war before me, came back with less to say and more to protect. I think this trust was the one thing that kept him standing. Tom understood. He had his own quiet battles. Some never left his chest. Some followed him like shadows across years. Max shifted suddenly. His ears snapped toward the window. A low growl rippled through his throat. Tom froze. The dog never growled without reason. George straightened in his chair, his hands gripping the armrests. What is it? Max stepped closer to the window, muscles coiled, tail straight. His body moved in clean lines, precise and focused. His amber eyes burned with alertness. Tom crossed the room quickly and peered through the glass. The outside light had dimmed. The forest was draped in a deep amber glow that was fading fast into gray. At first, he saw only trees and mist. Then something moved at the edge of the clearing. A shadow. It slipped between the trees, silent and fast. George reached for the heavy cane leaning against the wall. His jaw set hard. Tom could hear the sound of his breath grow short and sharp. Someone's out there. Tom's mind locked into the same quiet focus he had known too many times before. The kind learned not in peace, but in survival. He stepped away from the window slowly and checked the latch on the door. It was secure, but the feeling in his chest told him the forest had changed. Max gave a low bark, sharp and clipped, the kind that meant warning. Tom knelt and placed a hand on the dog's shoulder. Max stilled, but did not relax. George's voice was steady but low. This land has had watchers before. Some mean well, some don't. Tom glanced at the box again. The bell and the trust papers lay open on the floor, like the heart of something bigger than them. Someone outside had chosen the wrong moment to appear. The night gathered around the cabin as the wind rose through the trees. Tom felt the weight of the air pressing against the walls. It was not fear that stirred in his chest. It was an old readiness, a familiar edge he thought he had left behind long ago. George looked at him. His eyes no longer carried the soft calm of the evening before. They carried memory and a hint of fight. This place is worth something, Tom. More than most folks know. Tom nodded slowly. He could feel it too. The morning came with a thin layer of fog crawling low across the forest floor. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and wet earth. A soft drizzle hung in the sky, not enough to soak, but enough to blur the edges of the trees. The creek near George's cabin ran louder than usual, pushing against stones slick with moss. It was the kind of morning that usually promised quiet, but Tom Walker felt none of it. He stood on the porch with a cup of black coffee in his hand. His eyes were fixed on the winding dirt road that led into the forest. Max sat at his feet, tail curled around his legs, head tilted slightly, as if sensing the same unease. The dog had not barked, but the stillness in his posture spoke volumes. Tom had learned to trust that silence. A low rumble broke the quiet. It came from the road, steady and growing louder. Tom placed the mug on the porch railing. A black truck emerged through the mist, the company logo painted in deep green across its door. Everwood Timber. It rolled toward the cabin like something that did not belong here. George Whitman pushed the door open from inside. He leaned on his cane, but moved with the stubborn strength of a man who had spent a lifetime refusing to be moved by anyone. His flannel shirt hung loose around his thin frame. His jaw was set hard, and the lines around his eyes deepened. The truck stopped in front of the porch. A man stepped out, closing the door with a dull thud. He was in his early 50s, tall with broad shoulders and a posture that belonged to someone used to getting his way. His hair was steel gray and combed back neatly. A short, trimmed beard traced his square jaw, flecked with white. His skin carried the tan of a man who spent time outdoors, but the polish of someone who did not truly work the land. His name was Richard Hale. He wore a dark brown coat over a pressed shirt, clean jeans, and boots too new for the mud they stepped into. His voice, when he spoke, carried the smooth weight of practiced persuasion. "Morning, gentlemen." George did not answer right away. His knuckles whitened on the cane. Tom watched Richard's eyes scan the cabin, the creek, the woods beyond. He had the look of someone who did not see a forest. He saw numbers. Richard stepped closer to the porch, stopping just short of the first step. Everwood Timber has been watching this area for a while. Beautiful land, quiet, good water source. You've got something valuable here. George's voice came out rough but steady. It's not for sale. Richard's smile didn't falter, but something behind his eyes shifted. He took a slow breath, as if speaking to someone he believed he could still win over. Mr. Whitman, we're not here to steal anything. We're offering a fair deal, a development project. Cabins, resorts, jobs for the town, progress. Tom's chest tightened at the word. Progress was a word that carried sharp edges. He had seen what progress meant in other places. Trees cut down, silence replaced by noise, promises that rotted faster than they were made. George tilted his chin upward, meeting Richard's gaze without blinking. The forest doesn't need progress. Richard clasped his hands together loosely. You're holding on to something old. Things change. This place can't stay like this forever. It can and it will, George said. The silence between them thickened. Max let out a low growl from the porch, just enough to be heard. Richard glanced at the dog with an uneasy half-smile. Big dog. Tom's voice came low and calm. Loyal dog. Richard's smile faded at the edges. He took a step back, straightened his coat, and nodded slowly. Think about it. We'll be back. He turned, climbed into the truck, and drove away down the muddy road. The engine faded into the mist, leaving only the sound of the creek and Max's steady breathing. George leaned heavier on his cane. His shoulders sagged slightly, not from weakness, but from the weight of something old returning. He spoke softly, without looking at Tom. They tried once before, back when my father was alive. He chased them off. Now they're back. Tom felt the familiar tightening of purpose in his chest. He had spent years holding on to things other people wanted to take away. This fight was not new. It just wore different clothes. That night, the forest was thick with humidity. The drizzle had stopped, leaving behind damp leaves that stuck to boots and paws. Tom sat by the window, the fire casting a low orange glow across the room. George had gone to bed early. Max lay stretched out by the door, half asleep, but with one ear always tilted toward the outside. A faint crackle drifted through the night. Tom frowned. It wasn't wind. He stood up slowly. Max was on his feet before Tom reached the window. The dog's body tensed, tail stiff, a low growl building in his chest. Tom stepped onto the porch. The night smelled of wet earth and something else. Smoke. Thin but sharp. He followed the scent with Max close beside him. The forest at night was a place he had always respected. It held its own kind of silence. But now that silence was broken by the faint, dry hiss of burning. When they reached the edge of the clearing, Tom saw it. A small but growing fire eating its way through dry leaves near the old birch grove. It had started low, almost hidden, but if left alone, it would spread fast through the forest floor. Max barked sharply. Tom grabbed the shovel propped against a tree trunk and rushed forward. The heat licked at his skin as he threw dirt and kicked leaves away from the flames. Max circled the perimeter, barking to keep wildlife clear, his movements sharp and controlled. Tom worked fast. The fire was not strong yet, but the ground was dry beneath the wet topsoil. Whoever started it knew what they were doing. When the last ember hissed into black, Tom stood in the dark clearing with his breath heavy and the scent of smoke wrapped around him. Max stood at his side, fur bristled, ears sharp. Tom looked at the burnt patch of ground. This wasn't an accident. Back at the cabin, George stood on the porch, holding his cane tightly. The firelight from inside outlined his thin frame. His voice carried quiet anger. I smelled it. Tom's jaw tightened. They came sooner than I thought. George's eyes hardened, carrying a look Tom had seen before in soldiers who had lost too much but still refused to bow. We won't give this land to them. Tom felt the weight of the bell and the trust papers still locked away under the floor. The forest was not just old trees. It was a promise. And tonight, someone had tried to burn it. The forest woke to a cool breeze sliding through the maple leaves. The early sun filtered through the tall branches, scattering gold across the creek's surface. The air carried a crisp scent of wet moss and old bark. A few birds called from the canopy, their voices threading through the silence like the first lines of a forgotten song. Tom Walker stood at the kitchen table inside the cabin, staring at the old map spread before him. The edges were frayed, the paper brittle from years hidden beneath the floor. His fingers traced the faint ink lines, following the curves of the creek. Beside him, George Whitman adjusted his glasses with steady hands, though Tom noticed the slight tremor in his fingers. George leaned closer to the map. The morning light caught the silver in his beard. His voice was quiet but firm. There, that old symbol near the creek bend. I've seen it before. My father used to say, the oldest maple tree holds the first secret of this forest. Tom's jaw tightened slightly. He had spent years reading maps for war and survival, not for secrets buried beneath trees. But this one felt different. It carried the same kind of weight as an order that could not be ignored. Max padded over to the table, tail low, but wagging slowly. The dog pressed his nose against the map's edge, sniffing curiously. His thick, black and tan coat caught the sun spilling through the window. At 7 years old, Max moved with calm precision. When the forest spoke, he seemed to hear it first. Tom folded the map carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He met George's eyes and nodded. Let's go. The two men set out from the cabin, Max trotting ahead along the creek trail. The forest around them glowed softly in the morning light. Shafts of sunlight pierced the canopy and fell in golden streaks over damp soil. Tom could hear the sound of the creek beside them, steady and constant, like the pulse of something larger. George moved slower with his cane, but there was a determination in his steps that reminded Tom of men who refused to give up even when time pushed against them. Tom stayed close, but did not offer to help. George carried pride the way others carried shields. They followed the creek deeper into the forest. The air grew cooler as the trees grew taller. Eventually, the sound of the water widened, echoing softly as they reached a bend where sunlight broke through in wide beams. Before them stood the oldest maple tree Tom had ever seen. Its trunk was thick and rough with age, bark dark and almost black. Its branches stretched wide, forming a living roof over the forest floor. Its roots twisted deep into the earth, like the veins of something ancient and patient. George's breath caught in his throat. His eyes softened with a kind of reverence. My father brought me here once when I was a boy. He said the forest remembers. Tom ran his hand along the bark. It was rough, solid, unmoving. But something about it felt alive beneath the touch, like a slow heartbeat hidden deep within. Max circled the tree slowly, nose pressed to the ground. His ears flicked back and forth. Then he stopped near the largest root and gave 3 sharp taps with his paw. His signal. He had found something. Tom knelt beside the root. The soil there was looser than the rest. Beneath the fallen leaves was a round stone edge, half buried, forming the mouth of an old well. Moss grew thick along its sides. A faint draft of cool air rose from the darkness below. George lowered himself carefully to one knee, leaning on his cane. The old well. My father told me a bell once rang from here, that it kept the forest awake. Tom reached into his jacket and took out the small bronze bell they had found in the box. The metal felt cooler than the air around it. The engraving along its sides glimmered faintly in the sunlight. If the forest sleeps, wake her with this. He found a narrow notch cut into the stone rim. The bell fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting. Tom hesitated for a heartbeat. The forest was silent except for the distant call of a bird. Then he set the bell into place. A deep, low sound rolled from the well, like the breath of the earth itself. It was not a loud sound, but it traveled through the ground, up the trunks, and out through the canopy. The maple leaves shivered in response. The forest stirred. Max lifted his head and barked once, a sharp sound that cut through the air. His ears pointed toward the deeper part of the woods. The bark carried an edge Tom had learned to trust. The old tree seemed to sway, though there was no wind strong enough to move it. Leaves rustled against each other like whispers in a language too old for words. Tom felt the vibration travel through his boots and settle in his chest. It wasn't frightening. It felt like something awakening. George stared at the well, his eyes wide, not with fear, but recognition. My father was right. Tom scanned the tree line, the weight of the moment pressing against his ribs. Something had changed. He could not see it yet, but the forest no longer felt the same. It felt awake. Max growled softly, facing the darkness beyond the clearing. His amber eyes burned steady. Tom exhaled slowly, the echo of the bell still ringing in his bones. The sky hung low over Maple Hollow that morning, wrapped in a thin silver haze. A breeze drifted softly through the pines, carrying the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. The creek behind George's cabin moved quietly, its sound clear and steady like a heartbeat. The day had begun calm, but Tom Walker could feel the weight of something pressing beneath its stillness. He stood by the truck, his jacket zipped high against the cool air, one hand resting on Max's head. The German shepherd sat close, alert and steady. His coat shimmered faintly in the morning light, black and tan against the gray mist. Max had been quiet all morning, but Tom could read the signs in the dog's body, a subtle tension. Ears forward, chest high. Something was coming. Inside the cabin, George Whitman folded the trust papers with the care of someone handling something far older than himself. His movements were slow, but deliberate. His beard caught streaks of sunlight breaking through the window, and for a moment, Tom saw not an old man, but a keeper of something that mattered. George exhaled through his nose. They'll try to twist the law to take it, but the law still remembers ink. Tom nodded. His mind wasn't on the courthouse walls they were heading to. It was on the forest outside, on the fight they didn't choose, but couldn't turn away from. He had fought in different places before, different rules, but the feeling was the same. A soft knock came at the cabin door. Tom opened it to see Linda Carter standing on the porch. She was in her mid-30s, tall and lean, with a quiet but firm presence. Her dark brown hair was tied back in a loose braid that fell over her shoulder. Her skin carried a soft bronze tone from years of walking the dirt roads of the town. Her eyes were sharp and steady, the kind that weighed words carefully before speaking. Linda had been the town's school teacher for almost a decade. She was known for standing up for what she believed in, even when it made her the last voice in the room. A personal loss years earlier, when her family's farmland was sold to developers, had left a quiet fire in her. She had sworn never to watch another piece of the town's soul be taken away without a fight. She held a leather satchel close to her chest. Inside it were copies of the trust document, the map, and photographs of the bell at the well. She greeted Tom with a steady nod. "The judge won't ignore this. We'll make sure they can't." Tom studied her face for a second. There was no hesitation there, just resolve. He stepped aside for her to enter. George gave her a nod from his chair. Minutes later, they loaded into Tom's truck. George in the passenger seat, Linda in the back with the satchel, and Max stretched out on the floor, head up, ears twitching at every sound. The road into town was long and carved through the forest like a narrow scar. Mist drifted across the road, curling around the truck tires as they passed. When they reached the county courthouse, the parking lot was already crowded. 2 black SUVs bearing the Everwood Timber logo were parked near the steps. Men in hard hats stood in small clusters, talking quietly. Tom's jaw tightened at the sight. He had seen this before in other places. The polished calm before a legal storm. Inside, the courthouse smelled faintly of old wood and coffee. The hearing room was narrow, its walls paneled with dark oak. The judge's seat stood raised at the front. Reporters from the local paper sat near the back with notepads ready. Richard Hale was already there, dressed in a navy coat and polished shoes. His steel gray hair was perfectly in place. His face carried the same smooth expression as when he had first stood at George's porch, but his eyes were harder now, focused. Tom felt Max's body stiffen as they walked in. The dog's head lifted slightly, nostrils flaring. Tom recognized the change immediately. Max had caught a scent. Linda led the way to the front table. She laid the trust papers and map carefully before them. The small bronze bell lay wrapped in cloth beside the documents. Tom watched the way the judge's eyes flicked toward it with quiet curiosity. The judge, a woman in her 60s, with silver hair pulled into a neat bun, entered the room. Her name was Helen Parks. She had spent most of her career defending small towns against quiet erasures. Her face carried the weight of someone who had seen too many battles over land and too few victories. She began the hearing with a steady voice. "Counsel for Everwood Timber, you may begin." Richard Hale rose smoothly, his hands resting lightly on the table. He spoke of progress and opportunity, of resorts and jobs, of what could be built. His tone was calm but rehearsed, like someone reciting a plan that had worked too many times before. Linda stood when it was their turn. Her voice was steady, clear, carrying across the room without strain. She spoke of the trust, of the legal document created in 1935, of a forest meant to remain free from commercial hands. She held up the map, the trust, the photographs. Her words carried no polish, only truth, sharpened by years of quiet anger. Max shifted suddenly, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Tom knelt slightly and whispered a command. Max turned his head toward the window. Tom followed his gaze. Outside in the parking lot, beside one of the black SUVs, 2 workers were loading something into a truck. Max's ears twitched. His nose pressed against the glass. Tom asked quietly, "What is it, boy?" Max moved closer, then barked once, sharp and certain. Tom knew that bark. Gasoline. He rose and stepped outside. One of the workers glanced at him and froze for a fraction of a second too long. Tom approached the truck. The smell hit him before he even opened the door. A red container sat inside, half full of gasoline, the same smell from the fire at the edge of the forest. Minutes later, the sheriff arrived. The evidence was brought in. Linda's voice turned hard as steel. This is the company that speaks of progress. They tried to burn what they cannot buy. Judge Parks leaned back in her chair. Her eyes moved over the trust documents again, over the map, over the faces in the room. Then her voice came quiet but firm. The trust stands. The forest is protected. Everwood timber must withdraw. Richard Hale's jaw clenched. For the first time, his smooth exterior cracked. Outside, when the hearing ended, the forest breeze returned through the town. Tom stood on the courthouse steps, with Max at his side. George leaned on his cane, but his back was straight. Linda's braid fluttered slightly in the wind. Tom looked at the trees beyond the buildings. The fight wasn't over. But today, the forest had won. The forest stood quiet beneath a sky the color of faded gold. Autumn leaves drifted slowly across the creek, swirling in gentle circles before sinking below the water. The wind moved lightly through the tall trees, soft enough to sound like a sigh. It was a still day, but not an empty one. The forest carried a weight that Tom Walker felt in his chest, like a steady hand pressing against his heart. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low in the stone hearth, its light casting warm shadows across the old wooden floor. The air smelled of pine sap, smoke, and a faint trace of damp wool. George Whitman lay on the bed near the window. His face, once marked by sharp lines of stubborn strength, now softened beneath the pale light. His skin was thin and marked by the quiet work of time. His breathing came slow and shallow. The cane he once carried leaned forgotten against the wall. Tom sat in a wooden chair beside him, hands clasped loosely, elbows resting on his knees. He had seen men fade before, in deserts and in cities far from home, but this was different. There was no gunfire, no chaos. Only silence. Only the forest breathing outside. Max lay curled against George's bed, his body pressed close, ears half raised. The German shepherd had barely left his side since the illness worsened. His fur was warm against the wooden floor, and though his eyes remained alert, there was a weight in them too. Max had a way of knowing when something shifted beneath the surface of ordinary life. George stirred slightly, his eyes opening with effort. They were still the same clear blue Tom had first seen beneath the roots of that fallen tree, though now dulled by fatigue. His voice came low and rough like gravel against stone. Tom. Tom leaned closer, his voice steady, though a thin line of pain ran beneath it. I'm here. George's hand, weathered and thin, lifted slowly. In it, he held the folded trust document. His fingers trembled slightly, but his grip was sure. You keep this. The forest doesn't belong to men who build fences. It belongs to those who listen. Tom hesitated. He had never thought of himself as someone who could hold something bigger than himself. He was a man who had built bridges, cleared fields, fought silent wars. But George's eyes, even in their dimming light, saw him clearly. George gave a quiet laugh, broken by a cough. Don't look like that, son. This isn't a burden. It's a promise. Max shifted closer, pressing his head against George's arm. The old man's fingers brushed through the thick fur slowly, almost like memorizing the touch. The light outside grew softer, slipping lower between the trees. Tom's throat tightened, but he kept his voice even. You can rest now. George's eyes wandered toward the window, where the maple leaves spun in the breeze. His voice came as a whisper that seemed to blend with the wind. The forest will keep talking. Just listen. It will answer those who hear it. Tom felt the weight of the trust papers in his hands. The sound of the forest outside wrapped around him like an old story retold. George's breaths slowed. One last exhale left his chest and did not return. His face settled into a calm that was not sadness, but release. Tom sat still for a long time. Max did not move either. The dog pressed his body close to the bed, as if trying to keep the warmth from leaving. His eyes did not blink. His ears lowered slowly, not in fear, but in quiet understanding. Tom rose and walked to the door. Outside, the air was cold but clear. The sun had lowered beyond the ridge, painting the tops of the trees in amber. He stood there, holding the papers, feeling the forest around him. It was the same forest George had spent his life protecting. It was the same forest he had come to without meaning to stay. Now, it was his. Behind him, Max let out a low sound, almost like a sigh. Tom turned back. The dog still lay near George's bed, guarding even when there was nothing left to guard. Tom whispered softly to the wind, "I'll listen." The maple leaves rustled as if they had heard him. The late afternoon sun slipped softly through the tall trees, bathing Maple Hollow in a warm gold that made the leaves glow like embers. A light breeze carried the scent of maple and pine. The creek reflected the lanterns strung along its banks, their soft light swaying gently on the water. It was the kind of day when the forest didn't just stand still, it seemed to breathe. Tom Walker stood at the edge of the bridge, watching as townsfolk moved through the clearing. They carried wooden ladders, strings of paper lanterns, paint cans, and old tools. It was the first time in years that so many people had gathered in the forest not to take from it, but to give something back. Tom felt it deep in his chest, like a slow, rising warmth. Max stood beside him, tail sweeping the air in a calm rhythm. His black and tan coat gleamed in the soft light. Children ran up to pet him, laughing as his ears twitched and his head lowered gently to their small hands. Max had changed in their eyes. He was no longer just Tom's dog. He had become part of the forest's story. Near the cabin, Linda Carter directed a group of students from her school. She wore her usual denim jacket and work boots, her braids slightly loosened by the day's work. Her sleeves were rolled up, and there was paint on her hands, but her smile carried a rare brightness. She instructed two boys on how to secure lantern hooks to the porch beams. Her voice was patient but firm. She had a way of making people feel both capable and responsible at the same time. Further down by the creek, an elderly woman named Martha Dean arranged bouquets of dried wildflowers along the bridge railings. Martha was small and lean, with white hair tied in a neat bun and a face mapped with gentle wrinkles. She had lived in the town her entire life, and her hands moved with the ease of someone who had done this work for many seasons. Her soft voice hummed an old tune that the wind seemed to carry away like a quiet blessing. Tom watched it all quietly. For years, the forest had been a place of silence and battle for him. But now, it was something else. It was alive in a way he hadn't imagined. The town council arrived later in the afternoon. Among them was Judge Helen Parks, wearing a simple dark coat instead of her black robes. Her silver hair shimmered beneath the lantern light. She climbed the porch steps slowly, but with the authority of someone who had weathered many storms. She stood before the gathered crowd with a folded piece of paper in her hand. "This land has seen storms and silence," she said, "and it has waited a long time to be heard. By the power vested in the county court, the Maple Hollow Trust stands permanent. This forest is now under legal protection for all generations. The sound of applause rose like a wave through the clearing. Some people cheered, some wiped their eyes. The forest held the sound gently, the trees absorbing it the way they absorbed light and rain. Linda brushed a streak of paint from her cheek and looked toward Tom. Her smile carried the relief of a long fight finally finding its rest. Tom stepped up onto the porch. He held the small bronze bell in his hand. It felt cool and steady against his skin. For a moment, the noise of the crowd dimmed, and he heard only the creak, the breeze, and the soft rustle of maple leaves. George's words echoed in his memory like a quiet heartbeat. Listen to the forest. It will answer. He raised the bell and struck it lightly with his fingers. The sound that followed was low and rich, rolling out through the clearing like the breath of something old and kind. It moved through the trunks, over the creek, and up into the canopy. The maple leaves trembled in response, falling in soft spirals through the lantern light. The children gasped and laughed, spinning in the falling leaves. An old man near the bridge bowed his head. Martha pressed her hand against her chest. Linda closed her eyes for a moment, and a smile settled over her face like sunlight. Tom looked down at Max. The dog was still, ears forward, tail lifted slightly. His amber eyes reflected the lantern light. In that stillness, Tom felt what George had always tried to protect. This wasn't just a forest. It was a living memory. The night deepened, but the clearing glowed brighter. People lit more lanterns, their colors dancing in the air like fireflies. Music from an old fiddle floated through the trees. For the first time in many years, the forest was filled not with fear or silence, but with laughter. Tom stepped down from the porch, Max following at his side. He walked slowly toward the bridge, the bell still warm in his hand. The weight on his shoulders had not vanished, but it had changed. It no longer pressed down. It carried him forward. The forest rustled softly around him, and in that rustle, he heard it. A quiet answer. The lanterns burned brighter as the night deepened, their glow reflecting on the surface of the creek like countless stars gathered close to the earth. Tom stood beneath the old maple tree, Max resting beside him, and listened to the laughter and music flowing through the forest. What had once been a place of struggle had become a place of light. The forest no longer stood alone. It had a voice. It had a family. The journey from silence to celebration had been long. It began with a single act of kindness between a weary soldier and an old man in need. It grew through trust, courage, and a shared belief that some things are worth protecting. The people who once passed through the forest now stood together beneath its branches. They had learned that a single heart can fight, but a community can protect. The bell had been rung, and the forest answered. But it was never about magic in the trees. It was about the miracle in people, in their capacity to love, to stand together, to rebuild what others tried to break. It was a quiet reminder that light isn't given, it's carried. And when many hands carry it together, darkness has no place to stay. As the maple leaves swirled like golden prayers, Tom whispered a simple thought he knew well from his time with George. Miracles are not loud. They live in the spaces between people when they choose to care. This story, like the forest, is a reminder that faith can begin with something as small as a single act of kindness. Perhaps it is God's way of showing that He works not only through thunder, but through quiet hands, brave hearts, and the steady love between people and the world around them. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, and carry this light forward. And tonight, may God bless you and your home, just as He blessed this forest, quietly, gently, but forever.